Now let's talk about the manorial economy, or the economy of the landowner's estate. Especially in the early period of feudalism, the feudal estates were basically what is called a natural economy, meaning that it's a self-sufficient type of thing. The feudal estate consisted of the lord's domain, so their manor, their castle, whatever, and also the village surrounding it. And it was basically a mostly self-sustaining and self-contained unit, so they produced their own stuff and they consumed almost all of it, and also almost all the stuff they consumed, they produced themselves. Some goods had to be imported because they couldn't be produced locally, such as salt, sometimes iron tools if they didn't know how to make those locally, and these were supplied by wandering traders. So trade was something relatively rare and on a relatively small scale. Later on, things changed a little bit and there was an increase in division of labor, increase in exchange, and also development of the towns, but we'll talk about that later. In countries of the East, feudal relations were for a long time combined with slave relations. I believe when Marx speculated in his early unreleased economic manuscripts that there could have been a so-called Asiatic mode of production, he was actually talking about this. It's basically a transition or sort of a combination between slavery and feudalism, which existed, for instance, in China, India, and Japan, and some other countries. In these countries, state property was particularly important in feudalism. For example, in the period of the Baghdad Caliphate, in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, a large section of the peasants lived directly on the lands of the caliph and paid rent directly to the state. Also in Asia during this period, the patriarchal clan relations remained for a longer period and they were also to an extent combined with feudalism. Stuff like this still existed to a degree, for example in Tibet, until the liberation by the communists. In these countries where agriculture was heavily dependent on large-scale irrigation works, the state basically had to be more involved and the serfs had to be under direct control of the state, in some cases because they had to use the serfs to maintain these irrigation works. And also some feudal lords didn't base their power on ownership of farmland, but instead based it on ownership of pasture land. I think that's also something that should be pointed out, because we usually get the stereotypical view of the lords just owning a bunch of farmland, but that's not necessarily the case. So moving right along, let's talk about the medieval town, craft guilds and merchant guilds. Towns had already arisen under the slave-owning system, obviously. A lot of these really old towns like Rome, Venice, Constantinople, Paris, London, etc. survived and were inherited by the Middle Ages from the epoch of slavery. The workshops which were based on slavery broke down, but handicrafts still continued to exist. In the period of early Middle Ages, the towns and crafts developed very slowly. Craftsmen in the towns produced commodities so that they could sell them, but it wasn't possible for them to get enough livelihood from just selling commodities because there just simply wasn't a big enough market for them. So they also had to engage in personal agriculture. So even though they were handicraftsmen, they also had some farmland and they had to farm it. It was usually in the outskirts of the towns. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the peasants basically had to process agricultural raw materials, and then some of these peasants basically specialized in that, and they became craftsmen in their own village. When this specialization happened, it obviously improved productivity. As productivity slowly increased more, it became possible to produce more handicraft commodities than the local feudal estate or the village needed. So obviously then it became necessary to try to find new customers for these. The craftsmen began to settle around castles, or around monasteries, or in large villages and other trading centers. And thus gradually, in these central locations where a lot of people traveled, there emerged new towns, such as Kiev or Novgorod, for example. There was also a time when the handicrafts people would travel from one feudal estate to another because they could produce stuff for more than one feudal estate. But once they settled into towns, Slowly, their skills became perfected, productivity improved, technique improved. The feudal lords started to buy handicraft products exclusively from professional handicraftsmen in the towns. They were no longer satisfied with just the lower quality stuff made by their own serfs, and as a result there emerged this clear separation between agriculture and handicrafts, so that agriculture was done by peasants in the countryside and handicrafts was done by craftsmen in the towns. And obviously this kind of division of labor allowed for production to get more effective over time. The new towns that emerged, they were originally on lands that were owned by feudal lords or various church authorities or monasteries, and therefore they had to pay all kinds of duties to the feudal lord or to the monastery. So they basically had to pay rent in products or in money, and they were also under the political control of the feudal lord or the church. But the townspeople had completely different interests from the feudal estate, in fact, conflicting interest. But not only did they have a conflicting interest, they also had enough resources and power to try to struggle for their freedom, and partly by force and partly by means of purchase, towns obtained the right of self-administration. They had their own courts, they made their own coins, they collected their own taxes. There were also instances where the towns could be split between several feudal lords. So one feudal lord could own one part of the town and another feudal lord could own other parts of the town. And this also caused all kinds of bureaucratic problems, and that was another reason why the towns tried to free themselves from this. The town population consisted of craftsmen and merchants, and also some serfs escaped and found refuge in the towns. The towns acted as a center of commodity production, as distinct from the countryside, where natural economy prevailed. And because of two things, competition and for mutual protection from the feudal lords, the craftsmen united into guilds. The guild system existed in the feudal period in almost all countries. Guilds arose in Byzantium and Italy in the 9th and 10th centuries, and later in all of Western Europe and in Russia, and in countries of the East, such as Egypt and China, and in the Arab Caliphate they arose even earlier. The guilds basically united craftsmen of the same specific trade or of similar trades. There were different ranks of craftsmen. There were master craftsmen, who were full members of the guild, and each master craftsman had a small number of journeymen and apprentices. The guilds prevented anybody else from getting into that specific trade in that town, and they were able to regulate the whole process of production. They regulated the length of the working day, the number of journeymen and apprentices that each master could have. They defined the quality of raw materials and of the finished products and also of their prices, and they also frequently purchased raw materials together. These regulations eventually became these really well-established long traditions, and the aim of it was to prevent any of the master craftsmen from raising themselves above the others, and the guilds also worked as mutual aid organizations. In the first period of their existence, the guilds played a certain positive role in assisting the strengthening and developing of the crafts. However, eventually with the growth of commodity production and the expansion of the market, the guilds gradually became a hindrance on the development of the productive forces. Now, why is that? The strict regulations eventually became a hindrance on the craftsmen's initiative and began to hinder development of technique. In order to prevent competition, the guilds began to create all kinds of hindrances to those who wanted to get into the trade or who wanted to rise to the rank of master. It eventually became basically impossible for the apprentices and journeymen to become master craftsmen, and only the master craftsmen had full rights in the guilds and they controlled the guilds. So there actually emerged class struggle inside the guilds themselves, so that the master craftsmen were basically exploiting the apprentices and journeymen, so that the apprentices and journeymen were actually reduced to just being wage workers their whole lives, working for the master. The masters eventually had to intensify the exploitation of the journeymen and apprentices, making them work as many as 14 to 16 hours a day for an insignificant pay. As a result, the journeymen began to unite into secret brotherhoods to defend their interests. and the guilds and town authorities persecuted the journeymen's brotherhoods in every possible way. Obviously, there were also merchants, and the merchants were the richest people in the towns. The merchants also organized themselves into guilds, known as trade guilds or merchant guilds. In the East, they are known from the 9th century, and in Western Europe from the 9th or 10th century, and in Russia from the 12th century. The basic task of the merchant guild was to struggle with competition from outside merchants, to regulate trade and also to protect them from the feudal lords. In the 9th to 10th centuries, there already was considerable trade between the countries of the East and Western Europe. The Crusades in the 11th to 13th centuries played a great part in the expansion of trade. The purpose of the Crusades was basically to open trade routes which the Muslims were blocking, or they were imposing really high tariffs. In the 14th century, there arose a commercial union of towns, the German Hansa, which in the course of the following 2 centuries united about 80 towns of various European countries, and it carried on trade with England, Scandinavia, Poland, and Russia. Exchange eventually expanded more and more, and the economies of the feudal lords also got more and more involved into the market. The feudal lords wanted to buy luxury goods and also wanted to buy all kinds of useful articles from town craftsmen, and for that they needed money. To accomplish this, it suited the purposes of the feudal lords to switch their serfs into money rent, and it also gave them a further incentive to exploit the serfs even more, which intensified also the contradiction between town and country, because the countryside was being exploited so that the money could be transferred into the cities. Some further points about the class relations in feudalism. The 2 basic classes in feudalism were feudal lords and peasants, even though there were other kinds of classes too. The feudal lords were not all the same. There were petty feudal lords who had to pay tribute to more powerful, bigger lords. They had to help them in wars, but also they were protected by the more powerful lords. The more powerful lords, who were patrons of the weaker lords, were called barons or signors, and the weaker lords were called vassals. And the barons or signors themselves could also be vassals of even more powerful lords, and this is what is known as the feudal hierarchy. The feudal lords, as the ruling class, controlled the state. Now, during feudalism, the king was supposed to be the supreme authority and holder of all the power, but in actuality, feudalism was a period of great decentralization and disintegration, so that actually, especially in early periods of feudalism, the king's power was pretty insignificant and nominal. They of course had their own estate, which they controlled like any other landowner, but they in no way actually controlled the entire kingdom. Instead, they relied on this whole network of vassalage, where they essentially had to give the kingdom to be maintained and administered and ruled by the different lords under their vassalage. The different feudatories actually were complete masters of their own territories. They issued different laws, had their own courts, their own penalties, maintained their own armed forces. They fought against other lords, they stole each other's stuff. Some of them also printed their own money. So in most places there was no centralized state power. All the kingdoms were split into these different feuds or different fiefdoms. And the textbook points this out pretty succinctly. It says that, quote, "In the course of time, feudal relations created an exceedingly confused tangle of rights and obligations. Endless disputes and quarrels arose between the feudal lords. They were usually decided by force of arms in internecine wars." Unquote. Lastly, let's talk about the development of the productive forces of feudal society. In the feudal period, a higher level of productive forces was achieved compared with the period of slavery. In agriculture, there were better tools, such as the iron plow and other iron implements. New branches of cultivation, such as wine growing, winemaking, market gardening, developed considerably. Livestock husbandry grew, and especially horse breeding, because it was linked with the feudal lords' military. Sheep breeding also became widespread. Gradually, The implements of labor of the craftsmen and methods of processing raw materials were improved. Crafts began to be more and more specialized. Thus, for example, the blacksmith had formerly produced all metal articles, but in the course of time, the crafts of the armorer, nail-maker, cutler, and locksmith separated from the trade of the blacksmith. Similarly, the craft of the shoemaker and the saddle maker were separated from the craft of the leather worker. In the 16th to 17th centuries in Europe, the spinning wheel became widespread, and in the year 1600, the ribbon loom was invented. There were also improvements in smelting and working of iron, which was of decisive importance. Originally, this had been very primitive, but in the 14th century, the water wheel was first used to work the machinery that's needed for this, such as the bellows of the furnace and the hammers to crush the ore. Other kinds of inventions that were made were gunpowder, used for war, and also firearms in the 14th century, which required a lot of metal for cannonballs, which also stimulated the metal industry. In the first half of the 15th century, the first blast furnaces appeared. They started making pig iron, and also because of international trade, they had to develop better navigation technology, and the first compass was invented. And also something very important was the invention and spread of book printing. The development of the productive forces of feudal society more and more clashed with the narrow framework of feudal production relations. Although things had considerably improved compared to slavery, the peasantry at this point, under the heavy yoke of feudal exploitation, were in no condition to increase further the output of agricultural produce. Despite being better than slavery, the productivity of the serfs was still exceedingly low. And also in the towns, the productivity of the craftsmen came up against obstacles created by the guild regulations. Even though the feudal system was an advance compared to slavery, it was still a system characterized by a very slow rate of the development of production, by routine, and by the authority of tradition. Think about how long feudalism existed, give or take between 500 to 1000 years. So it emerged, developed to its peak, and then declined very slowly over a really long period of time. But eventually it reached a situation where it couldn't go any further, and it was necessary to have new relations of production. And next time we'll talk about that.